Meanwhile, as reported by the New York Times, Trump may have found a reason to prolong the nearly 16-year war in Afghanistan because of Afghanistan's untapped mineral deposits, which could be worth nearly $1 trillion. Trump is being pressured by a billionaire financier and a chemical executive to escalate the U.S. war in Afghanistan in a bid to exploit the country's mineral wealth. The Times reports that Trump discussed Afghanistan's vast deposit of metals and rare earth metals with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and is reportedly considering sending an envoy to Afghanistan to meet with mining officials. Now, as Professor Karen Greenberg, director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law School, wrote in her compelling piece, A Planet's Future Threatened by the Fate of Its Children, the death toll among children, for example, in Syria alone, reached at least 700 in 2016. As I mentioned, the death toll in Afghanistan is at record high numbers. For those who survive in Syria or Afghanistan or elsewhere, the prospect of homelessness and statelessness looms large. Approximately half of the refugee population consists of young people under the age of 18. For them and for the internally displaced, food is often scarce, especially in countries like Yemen, in the midst of a Saudi-led, American-backed war in which civilians are commonly the targets of airstrikes. And again, those civilians including children. Civilians are also being subjected to cholera, which is spreading, and a widespread famine is reportedly imminent. In a Yemeni scenario in which 17 people now are facing severe food insecurity, nearly 2 million children are already acutely malnourished. That number, like so many others emerging from the disaster that is the 21st century Middle East, is overwhelming. But as Professor Greenberg reminds us, we shouldn't let it numb us to the simple fact that each and every one of those 2 million young people is a child, like any other child, except that he or she is being deprived of the chance to grow up undamaged. With us today to talk about the current situation in Afghanistan and Yemen, as well as the ongoing impact that U.S. wars in the Middle East are having on children, is Professor Karen Greenberg, a noted expert on national security, terrorism, and civil liberties. She's the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, as I mentioned earlier. She's the author of The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days, which was selected as one of the best books of 2009 by The Washington Post and Slate.com. Her newest book, Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State, explores the war on terror's impact on justice and law in America. Welcome to Middle East in Focus, Professor Greenberg.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also joining us is Ben Norton, a writer and journalist whose work primarily focuses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and media criticism. He is currently a reporter for Alternet, and you can read his work at bennorton.com. He's also a regular guest on Middle East in Focus and provides us with great insight and explanation as to what is going on. Particularly today, we're going to talk about Afghanistan and Yemen. Welcome to Middle East in Focus, Mr. Norton.
Thanks so much for having me. Always glad to be here.
Mr. Norton, let's start with you. In what I had mentioned in my intro, just in case some people might just be joining us and missed it, the New York Times reported that Trump may have found a reason to prolong the nearly 16-year war in Afghanistan by wanting to tap into the untapped mineral deposits. Can you discuss the current situation in Afghanistan and specifically this new news with respect to Trump's intentions in Afghanistan?
Well, no, of course, the vast mineral deposits, especially of things like lithium and other minerals in Afghanistan, have always been a major factor. This is an area that has seen wars for decades. This was, of course, a factor even when the Soviet Union intervened in the 1980s and a war was waged there in which, of course, the U.S. backed the Mujahideen, which eventually became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as we know them today. So, the vast mineral deposits have always been an important concern and an important reason. No military initiative is ever launched solely for humanitarian reasons. That's simply a pretense in most cases. So, of course, that's a factor. And as for the war itself, things are looking quite bad. Of course, for the Afghan people themselves, who have suffered the most in this 16-year war, especially civilians and young children, as these UN reports keep documenting. Hundreds of children killed every single month, often from IEDs, from stray bullets, from other attacks, and the civilian toll is almost never reported on. There's very little attention. This is essentially a kind of invisible war here in the U.S. There's little media coverage, almost no discussion in Congress or any other parts of the government. And the Taliban is gaining ground. In fact, just this week, the Taliban seized a northern province, a strategically important province. So, of course, there's a crisis within the White House, and there are conflicting views as to what the U.S. is going to do. And Trump himself, believe it or not, as he has in every other policy, he's incredibly contradictory. He wants to have the cake and eat it too. He says that he wants to end U.S. wars abroad, which is, frankly, one of the only good things he's really said. But unfortunately, at the same time, he's actually escalating many of these conflicts and calling for ratcheting up the war on terror, which, again, has led to the rise and spread of many of these extremist groups and, of course, all these civilian casualties. And we can see this within his own White House. We see, Trump has essentially handed over control for civilian political decision-making to military officials, to generals, especially H.R. McMaster, his new national security advisor, who took over from the previous general, Michael Flynn. And naturally, McMaster has called for at least 4,000 new troops to be deployed to Afghanistan, and it looks like there is clearly no end in sight for this war. So, of course, what the U.S. is going to do is unclear, but it looks very likely that as opposed to winding down the war, the U.S. may do the opposite and continue, escalating it.
So, Mr. Norton, you had rightfully said that, the U.S. rarely ever goes solely for humanitarian reasons. I think it could be argued that they rarely ever go to war for humanitarian reasons, that there's always some sort of U.S. interest. What seems particularly unique in this situation, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, is Trump's blatant let me rephrase this. Trump's how blatant he is about the reasons why he wants to escalate, and specifically essentially stripping Afghanistan and the Afghan people of their right to their own resources. Can you comment on the dangers and illegality of Trump's intentions with Afghanistan and escalating and prolonging the war to secure, which he states very publicly, these nearly $1 trillion in minerals?
No, absolutely. And again, this also demonstrates the incredible hypocrisy and contradiction behind his pledges. He keeps saying America first. He says he wants to withdraw the U.S. military from the planet. But then he says, there are $1 trillion of mineral resources here that we should be tapping into and exploiting. And, of course, when he says these things, it appeals to different parts of his base. There are some parts of his base who do welcome a potential de-escalation of wars. And there are others who say, and sometimes this is the same person, they say, if we're going to be engaged in these violent conflicts abroad, we should only be doing it for material gain. And, of course, that is underlying a lot of these conflicts, and this is not new. For years, there's also been discussion of the TAPI pipeline from Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. So, natural gas is another important resource to consider in this conflict. These humanitarian pretenses, of course, are the things we hear, but the material concerns are what undergird a lot of government decisions. And the fact that Trump has removed the veil of that and is simply speaking about it openly, I think reflects a few facts. One, it reflects the complete degeneration of U.S. politics, where we no longer have these pretenses, where Trump is now, for instance, not just talking about ending undocumented immigration, but even documented legal immigration. When you look at his foreign policy, you see the same kind of barefaced duplicity. And it's certainly not just the case with the war in Afghanistan. We're dealing with an administration that appointed as the head of its foreign policy, as the Secretary of State, a former oil tycoon, someone who led ExxonMobil, one of the most destructive oil companies on the planet. This is a fossil fuel baron who is overseeing U.S. foreign policy. So, of course, it's no surprise that the president himself will openly speak about the fact that we should justify these violent conflicts abroad for material gain.
So I want to turn now to Yemen. And, as you mentioned earlier, Trump, on the one hand, as part of his campaign, talked about essentially American isolationism and trying and making sure to de-escalate America's involvement in wars abroad, but in fact has done quite the opposite in the Middle East. And Yemen is one of those places that has been truly brutalized by the Trump administration's policies with respect to Yemen. It has been reported that more than 2 years of brutal U.S.-Saudi war and blockade have created in Yemen the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Millions of people are on the brink of famine. Tens of thousands of civilians have lost their lives, mostly from preventable causes. And then making things worse, as we talked about in the intro, Yemen has been hit with the worst cholera epidemic since records began in 1949, with some 400,000 cases in the 3 months between late April and late July. Can you discuss in more detail the current situation in Yemen and U.S. foreign policies as it relates to Yemen?
Absolutely. Again, I just want to highlight some of the things you just said. We're dealing with what the UN has repeatedly warned is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. There are 4 countries right now that are on the verge of famine. Yemen is at the top of the list, along with Nigeria, South Sudan. We're talking about a catastrophic, almost incomprehensible conflict that's going on. Millions of people on the verge of famine. So just to underscore that and understand what we're talking about, since April 27th, according to the most recent report from the humanitarian group Save the Children, there have been more than 425,000 cholera cases. And for some context, in 2011, after the horrendous earthquake in Haiti, which is like Yemen, an incredibly impoverished country, there were slightly more than 300,000 cases of cholera in the entire year in Haiti. We're talking about more than 425,000 in 3 months. This is, as you just mentioned, this is the worst cholera crisis we have on record. And of course, the U.S. is directly complicit in what is happening. Donald Trump himself just 2 months ago visited Saudi Arabia and pledged to sell $100 billion in arms. And in fact, there's bipartisan support in Congress for these arms deals, even though many Congress people have been notified of the fact that these weapons are going to be used inside Yemen, as has already been documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other rights groups. In fact, the Congress just shot down, a bill to block a $510 million sale of precision-guided missiles from the U.S. to Saudi Arabia, and Congress people knew those missiles were going to be used in the war inside Yemen. The Yemen Data Project, which is a group led by academics and former Yemeni officials and other experts, has meticulously documented many of the attacks carried out by the Saudi-led U.S.-backed coalition inside Yemen. And according to the coalition, there have been more than 90,000 air sorties. But the Yemen Data Project's own information shows that about 1/3 of these coalition attacks have hit civilian areas inside Yemen. So now we're in a situation where more than half of the hospitals inside the country are either not operating or only partially operating. And Save the Children warns that 1 million children in Yemen are at the risk of cholera, which is, as the World Health Organization has repeatedly said and stressed, an easily treatable disease. In the West, this is a disease that has, for the most part, been eradicated. But now we have millions of people who could potentially suffer from it inside war-torn Yemen. This is an issue that really needs a lot more attention, and especially, I think, many Americans whose tax dollars are going towards supporting this ridiculous war that has only fueled death and misery and essentially led to the division of Yemen. More Americans should be aware of what's going on and speaking out.
This is Middle East in Focus, and we are talking about the current situation in Afghanistan and Yemen, as well as the ongoing impact that U.S. wars in the Middle East are having on children, with our guest, Karen Greenberg, director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and Ben Norton, writer and journalist for Alternate, who primarily focuses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and media criticism. Professor Greenberg, I want to bring you now into the conversation about, again, specifically the impact that we see U.S. wars in the Middle East having on children, and the humanitarian catastrophe, for example, that's hitting Yemen and how many of those victims are children. Can you discuss in detail the ways in which Donald Trump is essentially waging a war on children and how America's never-ending war on terror, as you state in your writings, quote, wreaks havoc on the physical, mental, and emotional health of children around the world?
Sure. First, let me just say that, Ben's overview that he just gave was really incredibly thoughtful and comprehensive. And a lot of this is sort of inside of his story, which is that for all of these bigger things that are happening in terms of geopolitics, in terms of confrontational warfare, the issue of families, children, even individuals gets completely lost. And to some extent, that's the more the numbers increase, the harder it is to focus on the fact that there are individuals, let alone individual children, being hurt, especially when you hear the numbers of children that are being killed. Because so already we have the statistics of children being killed, but what about all those who are suffering from so many other things? So there are a number of ways to understand what's happening with children, and I want to just preface this by saying this isn't just Donald Trump. One of the express intentions of the prior administrations in the war on terror, George Bush and Barack Obama, was to make sure that this war stayed off of American shores. And that was how they described it, that we were going to take this war to them rather than bringing it to us, a la 9/11. And so it's a decided policy that is very deeply rooted inside how we go about this war. So, for example, drone warfare is very much carries the message with it on every drone: we're not going to die for this war, but you are. And so there are all of these messages about the United States and the lack of concern for human life and actually the basic civilized guarantees, civilizational guarantees, that there's been a hardening of the hearts about it, I think, from the beginning. What's happening under Trump is that, well, first of all, we don't have a consistent policy, and we don't actually know where this policy is headed. And by we, I mean the United States. There is, in terms of Afghanistan, it's interesting. The three generals, Ben mentioned McMaster, but the three generals that are now embedded in this administration at the Pentagon and at the Chief of Staff and at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these three individuals all work together in Afghanistan very closely for a number of years, as I'm sure Ben knows. And so they in theory, they do understand Afghanistan, and there's a lot of discussion about pushback against wanting to do more in Afghanistan. So I actually don't know where that's going to go, and as the ultimate optimist, I'm thinking that the seasoned military may be able to put some brakes on some of these other plans that we hear about. So getting to the children, there are so many ways in which children are affected by this, and they seem obvious, but I'm going to go through them anyway. One is just something that's been going on for a long time, not necessarily exacerbated in this period of time, which is the general trauma of living in a war zone in which there are drone attacks from overhead, which just can explode a person, could be your relative, could be your brother, right in front of you, and what that means for that to happen to any human being, let alone a child. Another one are the number of refugees and the statistics that you mentioned. And I don't mean refugees just those who are leave their countries, but internal refugees, people who have been displaced within their countries throughout the Middle East, including Iraq, and what that means to actually be homeless and be on the road. And then embedded in that is the issue of children who are unaccompanied. That we don't have good statistics on this, but there are estimates now coming out of the UN, out of UNICEF, that the number of unaccompanied children in this refugee population has doubled since 2010. Now, that's worldwide, but we don't act, and that's a big problem, which Ben kind of referred to, which is it's hard to get these statistics in such a fluid and war-torn situation. You just put together all of these issues, and you realize that if we actually understood the damage that this can do to our globe, to have children who are broken as individuals and tortured in this way and deprived in this way at such a young age, you look at, we don't even have to do this out of compassion for these individuals, which I think we should do. But I'm saying just going forward to what this means for the globe as a whole going forward. When you have this amount of individuals who have been this damaged so young, what is the burden of taking care of these individuals as we go forward as a civilization? So the reason I'm focused on the children is, one, that it's just heartbreaking. That's the obvious. But it's also that if you want to talk about security and a future that's secure, it's security 101. Don't damage the children around the world, because when they grow up, they won't be able to react in the ways we need them to be able to react to run the world and to take care of one another when we're not here. That, plus the idea, and one thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention, which is that these children have become, you see a lot that they're prey to, traffickers and smugglers and other criminals, but they're also prey to terrorist groups and to nation states that are looking to have proxy fighters. And so these children are, in a way, up for grabs in terms of how the rest of the world is viewing them, and many ill-intentioned players are viewing them. And hungry, homeless, stateless, and looking for something, some kind of protection, or maybe even for food. It's amazing what these children can be convinced to do or forced to do. So this is you want to say it's a disaster in the making? No. This is a disaster that's been made. And the question is, how do we find our way out of it?
Well, Professor Greenberg, and actually Mr. Norton also brought it up as well, which is, unfortunately, it feels like there is a lack of real understanding of the kind of human catastrophe that is being caused globally by U.S. wars abroad, particularly in the Middle East. And one of the things that Chelsea Manning had actually said in her first interview since Obama commuted her in 35-year sentence and she was released from military prison is that she leaked documents about America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because, quote, we're getting all this information from all these different sources, and it's just death, destruction, mayhem. We're filtering it all through facts, statistic, reports, dates, times, locations, and eventually you just stop. I stopped seeing just statistics and information, and I started seeing people. Professor Greenberg, can you comment on the significance of what Ms. Manning is saying and how we can start seeing not just the statistics and information, but seeing people? Because I think that for a lot of people, if they really understood what was happening, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of people's real personal stories, maybe, just maybe, there would be much more of a massive movement to stop this.
Well, what happened with Chelsea Manning and the way she's reported it wasn't just the general sentiment that you just read, but was a specific incident where that she talks about, where she was observing, watching from afar an attack, a raid, and then in the midst of this raid, after they had gotten their target, I think, the U.S. troops blew up a van knowing there were children on it, or thinking there might be children on it, and knowing there were civilians on it, and it just destroyed her. And it was the pivotal moment. Interestingly enough, Oliver Stone, in his movie on Snowden, explains Snowden's radicalization in a way of tying it to this kind of seeing this kind of drone attack. So that's on that. I think in terms of getting people to understand it, I mean, I don't really know how, and I kind of defer to Ben, who's the journalist in the bunch here. But one thing I do want to say is I'm not so sure that hearing more and more about it isn't going to make hearts harder, because it is so difficult to hear these stories that in a way you can anticipate that one human response will be, don't tell me. And so in some ways we are incredibly dependent upon the people who have, major roles to play in international diplomacy, at the UN, and even in the U.S. government, to start to make things better. And it's great to have public opinion on your side, but, this is a crisis now. We don't have a lot of time to tell this story. And we'll see what USAID does. You know, they issue a report every year on children in adversity. It hasn't come out this year. They just, I think this week, the new head of USAID was finally confirmed. So we have I'd like to see where this is going to go in terms of what the United States could actually, or the rest of the world could actually start doing. And it would be great to have public opinion on their side, but with or without it, this is a problem that needs attention now.
And, you know, Professor Greenberg, I know you're a professor of law and, you know, not necessarily working within an organization that's trying to mobilize people for action. But, you know, if you could give some insight in the ways in which you think people can do something about this now that will have some sort of legal or political impact.
Yeah, I think forcing, this is very hard in the context of American politics right now, but I think forcing congressmen to care about this, I think, I'll tell you one thing, I think the younger breed that is running for office now needs to be briefed on this as they begin to develop their ideas as politicians. I think it has to become an automatic agenda item for people in Congress, and particularly for those who are looking to go into Congress to bring in some kind of new energy and new perspective. You know, anything can be done. Individuals who write stories about this, who keep the focus on it like so many others are trying to do, all of this is important, because this problem, it's going to have an impact at some point. And one of the saddest things about it is the people who would really understand this are other children who are empathic, who do understand. And I think it's just so unfair a burden to put on them. But at some point, the children of the world are going to realize what's being done to others like them in large numbers. And so, you know, and that's not advocacy, but that's what I think is going to happen to this conversation.
And Mr. Norton, I want to bring you back into this conversation to talk further about this point of the way in which, you know, again, I will say more mainstream media, but, you know, there is a way in which we're sort of desensitized to what's happening because it's talked about only in statistics and numbers. And then on top of that, not only are we desensitized, oftentimes we're not even told about what's really happening. And there are a lot of myths about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and what's happening with respect to the destruction that the U.S. is causing in the Middle East. And then specifically with respect to Yemen, can you highlight some of the most pervasive media myths on the U.S.-Saudi war in Yemen? Again, a place that is experiencing one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes in the world right now.
Absolutely, thanks. And I'm glad you point out not just the misleading, but also the lack of media coverage. Again, this is true for Afghanistan as well. There are certain conflicts abroad, like the war in Syria, they get a decent amount of coverage. That could even use war, of course. But then there are some wars that are essentially invisible. And I think another maybe historical comparison that's interesting to think about is the war in Korea and the war in Vietnam. I mean, the war in Korea got almost no attention in the U.S. when it was being waged, and it's still today known as the Invisible War. This is a war in which the U.S. government admitted that it killed 20% of Korea's population. I mean, it's just unfathomable. And, of course, the Vietnam War was 20 years long. It began in 1955, technically, and it was covert. And we didn't really start seeing the massive outrage and protests until the 60s, especially the end of the 60s. So there is a precedent for this kind of thing, unfortunately. But even today, in an age in which we have, you know, access to the internet and other forms of digital communication, basically 24/7, we still see this kind of media blackout. There are a few reasons for that in the case of Yemen. One, you know, as the professor had pointed out, and this is an incredibly important point, there are very few people on the ground in some of these conflict areas who can provide consistent, independent information. In the case of the war in Yemen, you know, of course, there's the very real concern of actually being wounded or killed. I recently actually heard from Patrick Coburn, who's a veteran Middle East correspondent for the British newspaper The Independent, and he, through correspondence with a friend of mine, he was asked if he was going to report inside Yemen, and he told a journalist friend of mine that he will not go into Yemen, even if he could, because he's too afraid. And this is a journalist who has reported in numerous other countries, including Syria. I mean, it's just very dangerous, and you don't have the kinds of protections guaranteed you would have in maybe some certain other places. But so in addition to the lack of people on the ground, the U.S.-Saudi coalition is preventing most international observers from entering the country. Fortunately, BBC was just allowed access into the country, although when they arrived to Yemen, the Saudi-backed administrators in the south, under the government led by President Hadi, refused their visa, even though the BBC journalists had a visa. And the air blockade that the U.S.-Saudi coalition has been imposing, in addition to the war they've been waging, not only has prevented important aid, humanitarian assistance, food, medicine, etc. It has also prevented international journalists and observers from entering, and essentially the only flights that are allowed are UN flights. So, of course, that is a major factor. But then related to what the actual coverage we get is, there are a few different talking points that pervade the media coverage of Yemen. And to really simplify them, of course, they're a bit more complex, but in a nutshell, the first is that the rebel movement inside Yemen, called the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, which is allied with the former ousted president. His name is Ali Abdullah Saleh. So there's a coalition government that was formed in the north of Yemen, which controls about 80% of the population. Frequently, when the Houthi movement is discussed in U.S. media, they're virtually always described using the phrases Iran-backed, Iranian allied, or even Iranian proxy. This is very, very misleading, and again, this is one of those talking points that is used to essentially justify foreign intervention. We also see it recently with the discussion of Iraq. The New York Times published a ridiculous, frankly, story that claimed that Iraq has essentially become a kind of Iranian colony, and they portray this as the supposed logical outgrowth of Iranian policy without mentioning the fact that Iran viciously opposed the war in Iraq, that Iran, in many ways was actually trying to prevent, even though they vehemently opposed the government of the dictator Saddam Hussein, they were trying to prevent that government from being overthrown because they feared the repercussions. And, of course, we saw that with ISIS and other groups. But anyway, when we look at the conflict in Yemen, we see this kind of similar discussion that is lifted from the war in Syria and Iraq and applied kind of ipso facto onto Yemen. And that is the argument that this is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is completely false. I mean, it is simply a lazy explanation for a more complex conflict. And again, I could talk about this for a long time, but just to simplify it really quickly, I'll mention that even the Carnegie Middle East Center, which is a nonpartisan, very moderate think tank that receives funding from the U.S. government, even they have published research acknowledging that Iran's influence inside Yemen is actually very minor. They published a very good article called Iran's Small Hand in Yemen, in which they pointed out that Iran hasn't really politically or militarily supported the Houthi movement that much. It's really been rhetorical and political support they've received from Tehran. So, I mean, there are so many things I could discuss, but in this limited time frame, I think it's really important for people to realize that this is not a proxy war in which Iran and the Saudi-U.S. coalition have equal footing. This is a war essentially being waged by a dozen external powers on Yemen, in which they're trying to restore to power a government which now governs about 20% of the population in the south, that is led by President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, who himself was supposedly elected in 2012 in an election without any other candidates, who then overstayed his term in office, and then who then resigned and fled to Saudi Arabia when the war began. I mean, this is one of many media myths that we really need to unpack.
This is Middle East in Focus, and we are talking about the current situation in Afghanistan and Yemen, as well as the ongoing impact that U.S. wars in the Middle East are having on children, with our guests, Karen Greenberg, Director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law, and Ben Norton, writer and journalist for Alternate, who primarily focuses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and media criticism. Thank you so much, Professor Greenberg, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And Ben Norton, again, Mr. Norton, thank you as always for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the great show.